Good morning. I'm Mike Kelly, a columnist for the Bergen Record, NorthJersey.com, and the USA Today Network, New Jersey. This morning, we're going to be talking on another live stream chat with three very expert guests. And our subject this morning is yesterday's arrest in Paterson of two councilmen who had just won elections to the city council, and two other campaign workers. All were charged with various involvement in a voter fraud scandal that the state attorney general had investigated and carried out a raid yesterday. My first guest is Mayor Andre Sea, the mayor of Paterson. I'm also joined this morning by Ashley Koenig. Ashley is assistant research professor at Rutgers and director of the Eagleton Center for Public Interest Polling, otherwise known as the Rutgers Eagleton Poll. And her organization just recently did a major poll here in New Jersey about voters' attitudes toward mail-in balloting. I'm also joined by Micah Rasmussen. He is the director of the Rebovich Institute for New Jersey Politics at Rider University. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the program.
Good morning, Mike.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Mike.
I should also say congratulations to Ashley. Ashley gave birth 5 days ago to her first child, a son named William Raymond. So congratulations, Ashley, and thanks for coming on. I hope you're doing well.
Doing great, and we're more than love than ever.
Oh, that's great to hear. Let me begin with Mayor Sea. Mayor, these are serious charges. There were two councilmen who had just recently won elections who were arrested, and two other campaign workers. As I mentioned at the top of the show, there are a variety of charges against them, but all of it involves what the Attorney General is alleging to be fraud in mail-in balloting. What does this mean for the city of Paterson?
You know, Paterson's known for having a proud history, and clearly this is a sad chapter, how this is unfolding right now. And a concern that I have, and many voters that I've spoken to, was that this election, the integrity of this election, was compromised. So that's why I commend the Attorney General for his vigilance. He's taken swift action, because going forward, I think our objective is to safeguard democracy. There is a certain sanctity to the vote. It's a core principle here in the United States of America. And we don't ever want that vote to ever be tarnished, tainted. In fact, I view a vote as a voice, and it looks like many voices were muted in this past election.
Well, yes, there's reports that there were bundled ballots. In fact, pretty early on, even before the election, I believe it was the Passaic Board of Elections had discounted a number of hundreds of ballots that were brought in. This strikes me as a textbook case in mail-in ballot fraud. What are your thoughts on that?
You know, you mentioned textbook. Mike, I've always talked about how Paterson should be a case study in a public administration or political science textbook, maybe at Rutgers, of course. But we don't want to make textbooks for this reason, as far as a potential case study in voter fraud. And I mean, we don't want to be tweeted by, we don't want Donald Trump to tweet about us, but now it's almost inevitable that he'll say something about what happened in this past election. We got to get it right. I talk to people and they feel like voting by mail is a way that we're going to just go and exercise our civic duty going forward. But obviously there's plenty of room for reform, because right now it's ripe for corruption. And I don't want to see that going forward. I mean, personally, I'm a purist. I like to go to the actual polling site, go behind and close that curtain and cast my ballot, pull the lever, and that's it. But
on that point, let me bring in Professor Koenig and also Mr. Rasmussen. Professor Koenig, your organization, the Rutgers, the Eagleton Center for Public Interest Polling, the Rutgers Eagleton poll, recently polled New Jersey voters about their attitudes on mail-in voting. Could you just summarize what you found?
Sure. So we polled New Jersey voters in relation to looking at the upcoming primary within New Jersey in July. And New Jersey voters were slightly, actually, we asked both the general population and registered voters within the Garden State. New Jerseyans are slightly more likely to say that the state should replace the July primary with complete voting by mail. And we actually gave a little bit of background information to respondents about, you know, the two sides of the coin here. We're talking about the coronavirus and the health of poll workers and voters versus, what could potentially happen with voting by mail and the debates and the theories that are out there in terms of increased ballot errors and election fraud and lost ballots.
Sure.
So 54% said that the state should replace the primary entirely with a vote by mail election. 42% said it should not. And of course, I think this is no surprise. We see this nationwide, deep partisan divisions on the subject within New Jersey.
Yes, Scott, I wonder if you could go through. I was struck by that. A vast majority of Democrats favor mail-in ballots. Vast majority of Republicans do not. And then you had a slight majority of independents. Why don't you go through those figures for me, please?
Right. So 70% of Democrats say that the state should replace the election in the primary election with mail-in ballots. 56% of independents say the same, but we see the numbers among Republicans completely flipped. 24% say it should, 72% of Republicans, no surprise there, say it should not. And this really mirrors national trends. There's a lot of different ways to ask this kind of question. We asked it about our own primary and something much more specific. Pew Research Center and the Gallup poll came out with polls within the past month as well, as this has become such a hot topic as we're entering primaries and then, of course, the election season for the general. And we see these parties.
Let me just, we lost your audio there for a second, Ashley. Let me just quickly pivot to Mr. Rasmussen. Micah, what are you seeing in terms of the national feeling about whether we should move to on election days, we should have more mail-in ballots?
Well, before President Trump decided that this mode of voting was not going to benefit him, before he really made this into a partisan issue, this was a relatively uncontroversial issue nationally. Right. 5 states, in fact, have all mail-in voting at this point: Washington, Utah, Oregon, Colorado, and Hawaii. Utah is a very Republican state. They're very happy with that mode of voting. Voter participation is higher in those states where we have all mail-in voting. So a lot of states are pretty far down the line. New Jersey, we are not as far as those other states, but we are pretty far down the line. We've been playing with expanding vote by mail for about the last 5 years. Every year there seems to be a new law to encourage more of it, as we've done away with absentee balloting and replacing it with vote by mail for any reason. You don't have to have a reason. You don't have to be out of state in order to be able to vote by mail. So this is only fairly newly, a controversial issue. And it doesn't really have to be. It's an important one in the age of COVID, right? You know, people want an alternative to being able to go, as the mayor said, we do like that tactile sensation of going into the polls and doing it, except when we feel that it's not safe. So, I think we all saw the horrible experience in Wisconsin where people had to really risk getting sick to wait in long lines for hours. And that's not what we want to see in New Jersey and in other places. So, in spite of making this into a partisan issue, a number of states are really pretty far down the line in expanding this. And the controversy aside, that's not really going to change or be stopped. What's really important in the context of the Paterson case is that we get it right. And so let's remember here that these people were caught, right? These offenders were caught and the fraud was detected. And it was a little bit silly and ridiculous that these folks were caught. They bundled hundreds of ballots together when you're only legally allowed to possess or help 3 voters at a time. So they were almost asking to be caught, but the fraud was detected here. So the system did hold. So
Mayor Saya, I wonder if I could get you to address this point. By the way, I should point out that those who were arrested were opponents of yours. They were major critics on the city council, and one of them even ran against you in the mayoral election.
Two of them ran against you.
2 of them ran. Okay. But this is this not a textbook case of if the charges bear out to be true, is this not a textbook case of mail-in ballot fraud? I mean, as Mr. Rasmussen points out, there are accusations that these guys actually bundled hundreds of these mail-in ballots and pretty much left a trail of breadcrumbs, so to speak, for the police or the investigators to follow in arresting them. How could this be stopped on the ground in Paterson, do you think?
Yeah. Mr. Rasmussen said it himself. I mean, you can be a bearer for 3, or you could be a messenger for 3, but these are 2. He's not the same individual. So it's 3 per person. And I feel like that was really abused from what I've heard in the election, because I'm very fearful of vote by mail. I don't really rely on it in the past. A lot of my voters don't like to vote by mail. They like to go to the poll. And again, I want to get back to the textbook, because I don't want to leave Ryder out either. We don't want to be a case study in Ryder or Rutgers textbook in public administration or political science for voter fraud. So, Mr. Rasmussen, I want to give you a little wink and a nod on that. Well, yeah.
Oh, I think this is going to be discussed nationally.
No, I said Donald Trump, unfortunately, is probably going to tweet about this one. I see it coming like any day now. And we're doing our best to position Paterson for progress. And this is a setback for us. It really is a setback, because it's almost like every 3 or 4 years we have an issue. We even had many issues in the past as far as voting fraud brought to light. But I mean, with my predecessor and his predecessor, we've had issues with that, and we've struggled, and it hurts our image. But right now, it's like we are able to attract the Devcos of the world to come in and develop in Paterson, and we're looking to restore Hinchliffe Stadium. But when you have situations like this, when you have a sword of Damocles hanging over your head, it doesn't make it easier to promote Paterson. It really makes my job tougher.
Professor Conan, I wonder if I could ask you about this. Were you hearing much in your survey from voters about their concerns about this question of and apparently how easy it is to commit fraud in mail-in ballot? What did you hear?
So we actually didn't ask anything open-ended like that, unfortunately, this time around. Those are some of the things that we did pose in the question, though, to put at the top of the mind of the respondent when they were responding to the question, the two different sides of this debate. I think, what we see through national polling is something very similar to what you said, and something that Micah said as well. Voters don't want to be forced. They're okay with expansion of vote by mail, but about only 20% of Americans have actually voted by mail. This is a sharp increase within the past 10 years, 10 years plus, but in 2016, about 1 in 5 voted by mail. So it's not like we see a huge swelling of this number, at least in the last general election. But I think, again, people don't want to be forced into it according to the polling numbers that we've seen. They're okay with expansion. They're not okay with elections being mandated as vote by mail only.
Do you think, though, given the COVID pandemic that is now seems to be spreading across the nation, that we're going to have more voters asking to vote by mail for the November elections?
I think this is going to go hand in hand with people's opinions on COVID. And at first we saw kind of nonpartisan, bipartisan support and similar attitudes at the beginning of COVID. And I think that's rapidly deteriorating as COVID is this slow burn that's not going away. And we're facing not only health issues, but also economic issues. And so COVID is becoming increasingly more politicized and polarized as an issue. And I think mail-in ballots play right into that. So, those who are concerned about the virus, they're probably going to be more likely to say we should vote by mail. Those who are not as concerned, they're going to say just the opposite.
Interesting. Micah, what could be done to stop the kinds of at least the alleged mail-in voter fraud that we saw in Paterson?
Well, it's an interesting question, because I've argued that that in-person voting and vote by mail voting actually have very comparable verifications involved, right? How so? Well, so if you go into the booth, you have a poll checker, right? You have a poll worker who works 1 or 2 days a year. They're volunteers. They, make $100 for going, working on election day. And they check your signature when you sign it. They compare it to the book, right? And then if the signature matches, they give you the number, and they let you go into the booth, right? It's a similar process. First thing that happens with the county clerk, if you send in an application, they check your signature against the book. Then they'll send you out a ballot, right? In this primary election, for the first time in New Jersey, we've actually skipped that step for some voters, and some voters have gotten ballots directly without filing an application if they're already registered Democrats or Republicans. But if you filed an application to get a ballot, then your signature is checked. If it matches, a ballot is issued. It gets sent to your home. It's numbered. It's barcoded. You send it back. And again, they check the barcode. They check to see that it was actually issued the way it was supposed to. They check your signature. They make sure that it's been filed correctly. They verify if you have been assisted, that you've been assisted by somebody who hasn't sent in more than 2 other ballots, because you can't do more than 3. So the process is very similar. I think the temptation or the willingness to believe is that the process is more anonymous, right? If you vote by mail, right? It's not, somebody's not looking over your shoulder and watching you. So I believe that there's maybe a temptation or a belief that there's a temptation that's there. But the process is actually very similar. And I would argue that the professional central people who check the votes in the county offices are, at least as well trained as the once or twice a year volunteers who do this.
In other words, there's not much training going on.
Well, that gets to. I'm sorry, Mayor. You go ahead. I don't want to interrupt.
No, I want to dovetail what you said, because I was thinking the same thing. It's about awareness, right? We have to educate people on how to do it right. If it's going to be the wave of the future, then we have to let them know about the bearer system, messenger system. Yeah. If you're not, a candidate can't touch a ballot. I'm not sure. I mean, we have 2 candidates that are being accused of voter fraud who are being accused of touching ballots.
Yeah, basically, I wonder if there's a misunderstanding here. These candidates were pulled on fairly technical charges, and that involves just actually delivering ballots to the Board of Elections. It's funny though. You all mentioned the possibility of fraud here. I mean, I think we know that fraud has been a part of elections for time immemorial. I mean, in my own family's case, my grandfather in Jersey City died in 1956, but family tradition says he managed to vote for John F. Kennedy in 1960. So
he chose the right guy. No disrespect to Richard Nixon.
Yeah, that's right.
That's what Governor Byrne always used to say, right? I will vote forever, so bury me in Hudson County.
Yeah. Sure. But Professor Coney,
we're in Lake County now, Micah.
Professor Coney, I wonder if I could turn to you here. What I'm picking up for you is that voters are open to the whole notion of being able to have that option for voting by mail. But do you have any thoughts on how we could prevent the kind of fraudulent practices that we may be seeing here in Paterson?
All I would say is it's going to take a lot of money, and this is one of the top issues when it comes to voting by mail, and in terms of rapidly turning it around if it becomes essential to the 2020 general. It's all about money and how much money it will take to actually do this process correctly, and to print the ballots and to train.
Would that be money for hiring qualified poll workers or people who could take a look at the processing of these ballots? Is that what you're talking about?
I would say everything from that to the printing, every step of the process that's involved. It's going to be a very expensive undertaking. Education of voters to know how to do it, what to do. It's a big uplift, especially within just a couple months, talking about the presidential, especially when we're talking about the primaries that are happening right now.
I'd like to drill down, Professor, on the partisan divide that you saw, because I kind of skipped over that when you mentioned it. What do you make of the fact that Democrats are so in favor of mail-in ballots here in New Jersey? Republicans, take a very opposite view. What do you make of that?
I think it's inherent in the different political ideologies, and I think it's especially has consequences if we're talking about the different party bases with Republicans and Democrats. Sure. So it allows much more diverse groups to be able to go and vote by mail instead of having to necessarily go in person. We know that voting in person is affected by a myriad of factors. What's the weather? What is your job schedule? Do you have kids at home? Now I do. Do you have kids at home? Can you go vote? So
did you give birth to a baby, right?
right, exactly. But he's coming with me to the polls. There are so many factors in terms of how and who can actually get out to vote that sure. I think Democrats see it as an expansion of who is able to vote, while Republicans see it maybe perhaps as an infringement on the inherent individualism of going out to the polls and who they foresee could actually turn out. It's all a game of voter turnout. That's the thing. So if one of the parties sees mail-in ballots being applicable to their turnout and boosting their turnout, they're going to support it. And we've definitely seen, at least in national polling, that Democrats have supported this much more so recently than they have in the past. Republicans, they're kind of at the same level of a lack of support in terms of mail-in ballots, but Democrats even more so in the time of COVID now are really supporting mail-in ballots.
Micah, let me put you on the spot here. As we go forward toward the November election, do you see this as being a major issue? As Professor Koenig points out, an issue that has a very defined partisan split?
Well, I think that the more the president points to it as a potential reason why he's struggling or why he might lose, I think it stands to be a question of the legitimacy of the election, right? We've seen that he's increasingly pointing to it as a reason why he's struggling and he's going to lose, and why it's important not to expand. So yeah, I think he has the ability to really exploit cases like Paterson and point to them and say, this is why I'm losing, even though that may very well not be the case. You asked, if I can pivot for just 1 second, I apologize, sure. But you asked what we need to do and what we need to spend money on, as Ashley talked about. One of the big points of concern right now is around signature verification.
Oh, really?
And there's been a lawsuit in New Jersey, recent settlement over some voter rights groups have sued and said the number of voters who vote by mail who are disqualified for not having a signature match is way up. It was 3% of ballots, vote by mail ballots, in 2018. More recently this year, we're looking at, I think in the most recent municipal election, it was almost 10% of ballots that were rejected for not having signature matches. And that could be not having a junior, if you registered that way. It could be having your maiden name. It could be anything. You just don't remember. You didn't put your middle initial, or you did put your middle initial. So one of the things that the voting rights groups have argued is that nobody, whether a once-a-year volunteer or somebody who works in the county clerk's office or the Board of Elections, is a signature expert, is a handwriting expert. So we need to get better. We need to have a process. Maybe it's an automated process. Maybe it's a scanning process. We need to have a process of checking signatures and verifying signatures, a better one than we do now. The stopgap measure, in the meantime, by the way, the settlement, and I know the mayor wants to make a comment, is that the settlement says that if your ballot is disqualified, for this year, you're going to be notified that it's been disqualified, and you're going to have an opportunity to cure it. You're going to have an opportunity to fix it.
Yeah, that's good. Mayor, let me ask you this though: the election that took place in Paterson, and in fact with the two councilmen who were elected, both of whom were critics of yours, we now are looking at both of those guys facing criminal charges. Is that election so tainted that it has to be done over, do you think?
You know, I've heard rumblings, because actually there was one specific election in the second ward where it ended up in a tie.
Yes, I know. I didn't get into the weeds too deeply on that. That's another factor here as well.
The candidate's brother is one of the individuals that was indicted yesterday.
Correct, yes.
But I also want to dovetail on something Micah said earlier relative to signatures, because I did get a lot of anecdotal information. What was happening was people were going to motor vehicles and signing I think it's the electronic signature. And some people have a tendency, like myself, to scribble your signature.
Sure.
And I feel like that posed a problem, because some people said, well, you know, I think what I did at motor vehicles, they matched to my signature on my ballot, and they disqualified my ballot. So that's something we have to secure going forward. But I think it's all about awareness and education. It's going to be, I mean, especially the Democratic Party, because November election is like do or die. So we're going to have to invest in raising awareness, educating people how to do it, going into churches, wherever it may be. If people are congregating, we have to explain to people how this works, because it is tough to transition. I mean, we've been upended by this pandemic, and one of the consequences is that we have to vote by mail.
Professor Koenig, I'm wondering if this is really the kind of lesson learned for the rest of the country. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I just want to dovetail off what the mayor said also. You know, in our poll that dealt with this issue, 6% actually knew the primary was happening on July 7th. So if we don't even have voters that know when the primary is happening, given the primary got moved, but actually the actual primary day of June 2nd, only 3% knew that it was the original primary day. So the amount of education that would be needed for something like this is a huge undertaking, given that voters don't even know when their own primary is, you know, and I know again.
But I think your poll also indicated that even after being told that the primary had been moved, the voters were interested in participating in a mail-in ballot, correct?
Yes, yeah, most definitely. But, again, that kind of goes back to the issue of education and educating voters about how to do this. And so if they don't even know when the primary is, it gets really difficult to educate voters on these big topics.
How might we do that? Do you have any thoughts?
It would be, again, a massive undertaking by the state in terms of, just very similar to what we're doing with COVID, whether it's doing social media, commercials, briefings. But again, all of that takes money and all of that takes time.
Sure. Mayor, in Paterson, do you think the people there, what's your sense of your constituents? Are they aware of the dangers of mail-in balloting, or do you think more education needs to be done?
And I believe now they are more than ever, because a lot of the folks that I spoke to immediately after the election results were released, they said that their faith in the process had been shaken.
Really?
And yes. So some people have actually called me today and said, I believe my faith in fairness has been restored, because they were a little leery of the VBM, vote by mail process to begin with.
Right.
Now they know that since it's come to light and we probably going to proceed in this direction in the future, well, now we're all aware. And something that Ashley said really struck a chord with me. I feel like I should call the Secretary of State and ask her if there's a game plan as far as voter awareness relative to voting by mail is concerned.
That's a good point. I think I'll call her as well.
Yeah, we all should call her, actually. If you need her cell number, I'll text you. But we should call her, because at the end, when it's all said and done, it's her office. And we got to make sure that what happened in Paterson doesn't happen anywhere else again.
But let me ask you directly, do we need to do a do-over on the city council elections that took place in May?
They're fighting for it. And I wouldn't.
Who is there? Are you in favor of that, or what?
So you have the candidates who obviously were on the short end of the stick saying, wait a minute, if it was voter fraud, then this election is entirely in question. It's been compromised. So I know, especially in the third ward where Mendez emerged victorious, there's a movement to have that thrown out. And then in the first ward, something similar is happening there. But in the second ward, like I stated before, it was a tie. So I don't see that happening. But from what I understand, the other candidate is going to go to court and say, wait a minute, there's some ballots that weren't counted because of signatures. And wait a minute, hold on one second. We've had issues with the mail, because there's a lot of mail carriers who are not just calling out sick, they call out scared. They don't want to get COVID-19. So we've had significant delays in delivery, and that poses a problem. I'll give you one example. In the second ward, gentleman said, look, I voted for X, and my ballot was postmarked May 12th. Well, it didn't arrive at the Board of Elections until June 3rd. That's not his fault. But those are two votes that didn't count in an election that ended in a tie.
This sounds like a nightmare. If you expand this, if you imagine the ripples from this kind of scenario expanding across the nation, Micah, are we looking at a potential nightmare come November?
At a bare minimum, we're talking about taking a lot of extra time to count these votes. So one of the things that we really need to adjust our expectations is knowing who's been elected president on election night. It very, very likely will take extra days, maybe even up to a week or more, to know who won some of these close states.
Yeah, if it's a close election, yes, of course. But I mean, given what President Trump has said about the potential for fraud, and it's of course, laying down that concern of his, Micah, do you think we may end up with a situation that Mayor Sayed just kind of described, where people are asking for essentially a do-over?
Well, I think it depends, as you just said, on how close the result is, right? So if there's a convincing win for one side or the other, then that argument goes away. If it's a very close race, then you're going to see that argument for sure.
Professor Koenig, you mentioned education. Are we ready to gear up for this in time for November?
Oh boy, I think that's a pretty loaded question. I mean, the clock is ticking. We have a essentially kind of phantom campaign going on for the president right now, because it's all virtual in this new world of COVID. I mean, it takes a lot of education. I mean, look at the census, for example, and especially that's been hampered by COVID itself also. But sure. I think it takes a lot of education, and we're into summer. We're going to be facing the conventions, whatever that may mean, in some form by the end of summer. And, then really hitting the ground running. And I just honestly don't know if there's the time. And right now, again, according to national polling, citizens are nervous. They don't think the people that need to be counted will be counted. They don't think that elections will be conducted fairly necessarily, and this is especially concentrated among Democrats. We see another bipartisan split. So there's a lot of polarization on these issues going forward, which makes it even harder to properly educate and move forward with implementing new systems.
Well, I'm going to leave that as the last word. I want to thank all of our guests this morning, Mayor Andre Sea of Paterson, Professor Ashley Koning, Director of the Rutgers-Eagleton Poll, and Micah Rasmussen, who is the Director of the Rebovich Center for New Jersey Politics at Rider University. Thank you very much for tuning in. I'm Mike Kelly. For more information on this and other stories about Paterson and our political reporting from the Record, please tune in to northjersey.com. Thank you very much.